Welcome back, everybody, to the Hope Axis. This is my little podcast project. This is the 8th episode. And already, the lineup is Glastonbury level, but like for podcasts. I feel amazing amazed by the incredible conversations that we've been having. And so will it be with Musa al-Gharbi, who's joining me from Long Island, right? And we will talk about your new book, published soon on the 8th of October. We have never been woke, the cultural contradictions of a new elite. Those of you who follow you, those of our viewers who follow you on Substack might be familiar with some of the ideas that you are proposing in the book. I had kind of a moral crisis while I was reading the book because it feels so familiar. I think the last time I felt like I want to bang the book into my head, or the other way around, was when I was reading George Pecker's Lost Best Hope. And you are reading about smart America and the insane levels of self-delusion and hypocrisy in the educated classes. I'm an immigrant here, but I'm already assimilating into that myself. But you need to hear it, right? You need to hear what's the difference between being productive and being symbolic in today's capitalism, if it's still capitalism. So welcome to the podcast, The Hope Axis, Musa. The title kind of gives away that we are rather hopeful over here. So even when we go into a really messed up situation, like some that arise in and around symbolic capitalism or through symbolic domination, we try to figure out, okay, but what should we do about this? How can we be more truthful, more actually well-meaning, and actually helpful to our fellow man? Beyond the words, beyond the platitudes, beyond just kind of striving for more power ourselves, and to maybe contribute to society as one does. So welcome, Musa. I'm so incredibly delighted that you're here. Tell us how, you talk in your book about selling shoes in what looks like the middle of nowhere from a New York vantage point. What was the road that led from there to falling in love with Bourdieu's work and developing your distrust of elites so young and at such a fragile age?
So I had a weird path to academia. So after I went on a whole bunch of just personal journeys myself in my own life. So my initial kind of vision for what I wanted to do in life was to be a Catholic priest. Then I had this crisis of faith. For a while after that, I had no idea what I wanted to do with my life. And I was just taking classes off and on at community college while managing businesses in the private sector and doing sales depending on the year. And during this period, there was a professor at the community college that I was at, Cochise College, Mike Jaworski. And he had an illustrious career before he taught at Cochise College. So he was part of the Harvard Society of Fellows, and he worked at the World Bank for a while. But then his wife had kind of a mental crisis, and they decided to slow down their pace of life. And so they ended up in this small town where I lived, and he was just teaching at the community college, mostly for fun. And he took me under his wing and really as I was kind of going through this existential crisis. And so during that period, for instance, I wasn't taking classes consistently. I was at community college for like 6 years. But for a lot of that time, regardless of whether or not I was taking classes, me and Jaworski would be doing various kinds of private studies. So we did, deep dives into the classics. He started teaching me Latin. We did deep dives into various types of philosophy and social theory. And it was during that time I started gravitating towards philosophy as a way of exploring some of the same questions and themes that I had been interested in from when I was a theologian, but from a secular point of view. And so when I decided to, after I got my life together, and I started to aim myself at universities, at four-year colleges and universities, I planned on studying philosophy. And I got into New York University, which was one of the top universities it had a lot of people there who were studying what I was interested in at the time, which was metaphysics. So the structure and nature of reality, questions about the meaning of life, this kind of big picture stuff. And at the time, I thought politics was stupid. It was kind of people getting distracted by the little things. And then I had a twin brother, and he was killed. He died in Afghanistan just shortly before I was getting ready to move, and kind of working through that tragedy. For one, I decided to just stay in Arizona to be near my family as we were kind of. So I went to University of Arizona, which also has an outstanding, philosophy program, but more importantly, it was near my folks. And I also switched my focus from metaphysics and stuff like this to applied social epistemology. So what do we know in virtue of what? And to kind of, with the aim of focusing on national security and foreign policy issues and helping other people avoid the same kind of tragedy that my own family was working through. And so during that time, while I pursued my bachelor's and my master's in philosophy, I also pursued a second degree in Near Eastern Studies, and I started managing an academic consortium that brought together students who were veterans, military veterans, and students from war-affected regions to study conflict together. And then after I got my master's degree, I was teaching for a while at the University of Arizona, teaching classes on international organizations, national security policy, and things like this, until I got canceled by Fox News, and then I lost that job. And so it's been a weird path.
How can Fox News cancel you? I thought it was the left that cancels you. That was before?
Oh, well,
where the left had discovered cancellation as like a...
Yeah, I mean, the right, the political right has a long history.
Was it around the stuff you were like too much of a dove?
Yeah, so there's so this was in 2014, and it was the height of ISIS, and at that time there was kind of a cottage industry for people who were either ex-Muslims or people who grew up in Muslim majority countries but weren't Muslims. Like, if you wanted to go on right-aligned media at that time and say, Muslims are horrible, I would know. There was kind of a little cottage circuit for that. And I got into an argument on Twitter with someone who was part of that circuit about an article that I had published in in Middle East Policy, which was very exciting. It was a #1 cited journal at that time. It was a big deal. I was very proud of this article. And so someone from that circuit ended up reading this article and trying to get into an argument with me about it. And I don't even engage like this on social media anymore, for partly because of and also partly because I just evolved as a scholar. But basically, I set out to destroy this person. And as it became very clear that they were ignorant on the empirical side of things, they tried to shift gears and talk about things like liberty and justice and freedom. And I was like, great, I'm a philosopher. Let's do that. I just kind of really twisted the knife and showed that this was a vacuous individual. But the problem with that is this other person had much bigger platforms than me. I was a columnist for Al Jazeera, and I was an adjunct instructor, but he had access to Fox News. And so on election day, so he basically set out to launch the smear campaign by going through all my different essays and taking bits and pieces way out of context and making it seem like I'm some kind of anti-American radical. And the whole reason I was doing any of this work is because I'm from a military family and a military community, and I personally know loss from the war. But on election day 2014, if you would have gone to foxnews.com, the first thing you would have seen is my beautiful face. Professor radicalizing the youth at University of Arizona. They talked about me on air a couple of times. Every department and institution I was affiliated with got flooded with death threats and hate mail and stuff like this. And so in the aftermath of that, even though I had glowing teaching evaluations and I was publishing more than actual professors, which I was not, contrary to Fox News's description. Anyway, they just didn't renew my teaching contract. And so this was kind of a bleak period.
Yeah, but at least it's Fox News. Like, if you are canceled, you want to be canceled by a major media institution, right? Like, not some rando on Twitter. Good job.
Absolutely. I got canceled by the best.
We just had Bill Cly on the podcast, one of the most famous veteran fiction writers. But he's also, talking about war and some of the shame associated and the unspoken loss or unspoken of loss from that vantage point, right? Like from the inside. It's so interesting how I think hawks are even more sensitive to that kind of criticism.
And also,
it's like a betrayal, right? It's a betrayal.
Yes, it is. And I'll say, one of the things that was surreal. So after I got canceled by Fox, basically, I started by trying to engage more with the right. I was trying to work through, how did this happen? How were so many people so willing to believe this kind of insane cartoon? And I realized that part of the reason why is that people like me didn't really engage much with Fox News viewers. And when we do, it's often in this kind of disdainful, mocking, aggressive, confrontational way. So I responded to getting canceled by Fox by trying to engage more with right-leaning media. I started taking the same essays that I would normally publish somewhere like Al Jazeera and aiming them instead at the American Conservative or the National Interest or National Review. And not only were they published, but the conversations that I had with people in these spaces, with people who didn't already agree with me, were a lot more enriching. And the act of trying to describe these issues and make these points to audiences who didn't already share this set of things also helped me see kind of blind spots that I had and how I was thinking and talking about these issues, helped me understand things more deeply. And it was more effective, I realized. So if you want to convince people not to bomb Syria, you should not start by taking people who already agree with you about why that's a bad idea. You need to go to the people who actually want to bomb Syria and explain to them in a way that they find compelling and accessible why they shouldn't do that. So my whole way that I do public engagement shifted. So now, basically, no matter who I write for, I try to say something that I think that audience needs to hear but doesn't want to hear. So when I'm writing in left-leaning outlets, I'm saying things that are uncomfortable for left-leaning audiences. And when I write for right-leaning outlets, I try to do the same thing. And
this was like before, just for our listeners, right? Like today, being politically bi-curious is the way to that you are in the know. But at the time, like even 6-7 years ago, like we are talking before Substack, before Quillette, before
Heterodox Academy and stuff like this. Yeah.
What's going on Twitter these days? I mean, we think that we are more polarized now than we ever were, but we used to not talk to each other at all.
Yeah. I mean, one of the benefits of the Trump election, I think, was that a lot of people in America became a lot more concerned with things like bridge building and overcoming polarization and things like this.
I mean, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And as one sign of how successfully I was able to bridge these gaps in my own life, probably a good 6-7 years after I got canceled by Fox News, I actually got invited on Fox News. I was on the Ingram angle talking about my research about how Trump voters, about how scholars and journalists often misunderstand and misrepresent Trump voters.
Wow.
And actually, this is the most surreal thing about that. So I'm in the Fox studio, and I'm in the room, like, what's his name? Hannity is there, just yucking it up with people. And I realized, and a few things became clear. One of them was that basically no one there remembered that, they had tried to destroy my life not long ago. And then
who has been canceled will remember that the cancellation happened, and everybody moves on with their lives, and they cancel somebody else, And
well, yeah, and this is the thing. This was the most disturbing thing to realize, is that for the person who led the cancellation campaign, the guy whose skin I got under, and all, for him it was personal. But for everybody else, they were just killing airtime until the election news came out on election day 2014. It was completely impersonal. There was nothing personal about it. They just kind of casually destroyed my life as a way to kind of fulfill the time. And that was disturbing in a way, but it's also kind of, because like you almost want it to be personal, right? Like if someone's gonna really,
it might as well at least temporarily make sense to this person.
yeah, you want them to care at least a little bit, like
Yeah. The roadkill, absolutely. What's the roadkill equivalent of cancel culture? I mean, you're an assistant professor at the Stony Brook School of Communication and Journalism. Is this something that you teach your journalism students? Like, do you? I haven't been to school in 10 years. Are there like cancel culture classes? Do people get credits for this? What to do when you're canceled as a journalist, or how to cancel people? What's the academic background on this?
Yeah, so at Stony Brook, anyway, we don't have any classes that are focused on these kinds of dynamics too much. For Heterodox Academy, we did try to conduct a lot of research and produce resources to help people navigate when they find themselves in the crosshairs of some powerful person or group. And recently, colleagues and I published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences looking at censorship and self-censorship in science. And one of the things we found is that when people think about censorship, they often think of governments trying to suppress people, or maybe even students leading mobs, or outside actors like Fox News, leading. But what we find is that censorship in science tends to be driven heavily by scientists themselves, often motivated by what you might call pro-social concerns. So they're concerned that the findings depict some group in a bad light, or would be used by the wrong kinds of political actors, or might lead people astray who aren't as in the weeds about the literature and things like this. So these kinds of pro-social motives that scientists have lead them to try to suppress other scientists' findings, or even self-censor, just report, or even lead them to not report their own findings, or even not conduct certain lines of research at all. I
remember reading this paper. It's quite a journey.
Yeah.
Thinking like, you start thinking in a kind of game theoretical way, like what makes somebody self-censor? Does it become something where you can convince a group of people that there's a danger, and the danger might not even be there, but there's no way to check because nobody probes it?
Yeah. Oftentimes when people make these claims about harm, or they have these concerns about harm, they're not usually quantified in any kind of meaningful way. So people will say this will cause harm to X population, but there's not really any attempt to measure that. There's often not even really a good story. Like if you have people walk through, okay, how concretely will me publishing this paper lead to someone getting killed or abused or harassed? Walk me through in concrete details the connection between me publishing this academic paper and the harm that would purportedly be caused. And people can't often do that, and they don't even try. It's
because of Jodie Foster or something,
yeah.
The connections are very, very weak.
Yes, absolutely. But on the plus side,
you talk about your book, right? There's something, whenever we talk about symbolism, you talk about totem capitalism, like we're talking about kind of ancient rainmaking, and how there are like words and narratives in our culture today, because we have never been modern, that are magic spells, right? We are worried about jinxing something, but unleashing something.
Yes.
And that we feel out of control of how to manage those, invisible forces that we presume to be there. The only thing we can do is at least not say those words, or not publish that paper. You think, okay, is it how magically thinking is this person in this moment? Is it just cold, calculated, career thinking? I don't want to lose my research job with this paper potentially. Or are you really worried about whatever this might bring on I don't know, on the proteins that you're after you have been researching.
Yeah. Well, and I talk about this, as you know, I like one of the things I note in the book is sometimes one thing that helps drive cancel culture a lot of times is precisely this feeling of helplessness, right? So there's some big problem like racialized inequality.
The volcano, but we can kill the child, right?
Yes.
Like, advice.
Absolutely. Yeah, we can't end racial equality. We can't end racial inequality. But what we can do is this individual person who made an offhand racial comment, we can mess that person up. We can completely destroy that person. And sure, again, it's not going to lift anyone out of poverty or get anyone released from jail or anything like that. But what it will do is give us a sense that we're doing something about this problem that we otherwise feel kind of helpless or overwhelmed in the face of.
It's so interesting to me. I didn't really, or maybe I knew I forgot about your past with the Catholic clergy, but I also had this, and I wanted to become a monk, and I converted to Catholicism when I was 12 and had a decade in my life dedicated to this calling or work. And I think, I also ended up in philosophy and kind of obsessed with what's real as well, in various different ways. And this is, I think there's a route there. There's a logic there that leads you from one station of this journey to the next, where first you just get an inkling that there is something else and that we might do something about that, or that my life would not be complete or even real unless I acknowledged and in some ways served this thing, right, beyond the veil. And then some people, at this point go into religion. Some people, I don't know, drop acid, like whatever you might end up doing, or both, be my guest. But a lot of people actually realize that the extremes are not where you might want to spend your whole life. It's something that you have to taste or get a taste of. And then there is the real kind of utility of it is when you bring in kind of a Nietzschean way that insight from the bottom or the extreme back into real life, and you to do something with it in, for instance, how we understand everyday society, like your Uber Eats delivery that you're so beautifully and poetically expanding on in your book. So I want to kind of go to Bourdieu and for us to introduce him a little bit to our viewers and our listeners. To me, he's one of the most important thinkers that I've ever come across. And even if you're just like looking at his graphs, I mean, you never look at golf again the same way once you've noticed in that 2x2. I think about that I'm in New York right now, so I think about that 2x2 so many times, like the leisure principle and what people do. And, a lot of people talk about signaling and virtue signaling and kind of like do it from an evolutionary psychology angle. But you are looking at more kind of the parallel anthropology. That's how it's called, right? Parallel anthropology? Yeah.
Symmetric anthropology.
Sorry, symmetrical anthropology. Do you want to maybe talk a little bit about how did you go from religion to philosophy and then Bourdieu?
Oh, sure. Well,
was it that to you he recognized about this kind of dualism that I still think we live in? And what did you learn from him?
Yeah. So the path to from where I left off to social science was basically gradually, as I was doing this work with the focused on national security, foreign policy, and working with this academic consortium that studies Middle East conflict, things like this. I realized that some of the questions that I had weren't really questions that I could just kind of sit in my armchair and think about and get to the answers to, right? So like the theorizing is important, it's valuable. But to get where I wanted to actually get like a satisfying answer to some of these questions, I needed to move beyond that. I needed different tools, different methods. And so this is why when I eventually applied to PhD programs, in addition to applying to philosophy programs, I also applied to sociology programs, and ultimately I decided to attend Columbia Sociology. That whole process was its own thing. But
you needed more math. You were like, I need something where I can do statistics. Was that the consideration?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, so a lot of my work is kind of quantity, but I also think some of the other tools of sociology, like ethnographic studies and things like this, are valuable. And I really love work that kind of harmonizes them. Um, and in some ways, actually, Bourdieu is a great example of this, right? So he combines a lot of kind of high level data with these kinds of close looks at like how people are behaving, how they're interacting, what are they doing, what seems to be driving them. And I think that's where the magic happens in my discipline, honestly, is kind of at that intersection. And so how I became interested in Bourdieu was a few things. One, like his whole kind of life trajectory resonates with me in some ways. So it's not identical, but he also came from what you might consider what was a non-traditional background. Where academics in France, and in the early days of his career struggled to get taken seriously and was actually kind of treated with disdain and things like this. And then these kinds of early experiences created a sense of disconnect that was never fully that prevented him from fully integrating and feeling part of the thing. Even later, when he became super successful and renowned and all of this kind of stuff, he still there was this distance, and it helped drive his research agenda.
If you want to analyze the elites, it helps to be a little bit on the outside.
Yes, absolutely. George Simmel made a similar point. He had in a lot of his work, he had this kind of social archetype of the stranger, who's someone who's like part in, part out, and part insider, part outsider, and kind of is able to see things in a different way than someone who's fully outside the system or was fully kind of inside the system. And so, yeah, I think that helped. And in my case too, I mean, so part of what inspired the book in a lot of ways is that I came from this small military town and this community college, and then a land-grant university. And then I was at an Ivy League school in the middle of Manhattan. And right around the time that Trump got elected. And, the area I grew up in, Arizona, was decisively red. Manhattan went 95-5 for Clinton in 2016. And even that is shocking, because 5% is no joke. It's like 1 in 20 people in this district voted for Trump. Like, who are they? I have never met. I'm intensely curious about these. But anyway, so this cultural whiplash, both in terms of the different political milieu I found myself into, the different class milieu I found myself into, the different kind of moral frameworks that the people I was currently surrounded by were working with. Especially to arrive there at such a contentious time, just, again, like right after Trump was elected, right before Trump was elected, better. I spent a lot of time, especially my first few years there, just trying to figure out, like, what the heck is going on here? and my kind of efforts to understand what the heck is going on here, and to try to figure out kind of where I would fit in this puzzle of whatever was happening here, was kind of the first steps towards writing this book.
And I find that, and you will tell me if this resonates or not, but amongst my American friends, I find that, these are two things that don't really exist in everyday European life, but do exist in American life, are the military brat and the Mormon. And whenever I talk to my Mormon friends or who grew up Mormon, and whenever I talk to my friends who grew up in military towns, they will talk about a completely different, deeper understanding of what community is, what community roles are, what altruism is, what it means to be able to rely on somebody and feel being taken care of. Ex-evangelical friends will also talk about it, but usually with a lot of psychological layers to it, right? When I'm talking about like positive depictions of this. And so I'm always curious when somebody, a friend of mine who grew up that way actually goes into either founding communities or writing about them. Yeah. You in some ways, would you agree that in some ways you understand it better than somebody growing up in a huge city or moving around a lot and being kind of the anonymous kid you see the structures, right? The scaffolding of what makes a community work or fall apart.
Yeah, that might be true. I'd like to think that's true. I have a self-interest. I have a strong self-motivation to believe that that's true.
Completely, in a completely unbiased fashion, agrees without anger or bias.
Yeah. Yeah, and so...
Inside there, you both are strangers, and you were both, kind of dropped into a situation where you're kind of interacting with the elites, but also are on the margins in some ways. And you start picking up on things that the elites think about themselves, but you disagree. What were those?
Yeah, well, and then also I'll just note, Bourdieu was also writing at a time of intense cultural and political contestation. So he was writing at the time of what I call in the book the second Great Awakening, which occurred in the mid '60s through the early '70s. So he has a great book that he wrote around that time called Homo Academicus, that was looking at how a lot of scholars at that time were attaching themselves to social justice movements, to the anti-war movement, to movements for civil rights, to movements for feminism, and so on and so forth, that were also leveraging these movements in the service of their own ends, in the service of enhancing their own status, of enhancing their own prestige, of enhancing their careers. And so in a lot of ways, what We Have Never Been Woke is doing at bottom, I guess, is kind of extending some of Bourdieu's insights into the 2020s and adding a bunch more cases. So at the time Bourdieu was writing, what he was experiencing seemed very new. There had only really been one other awakening at that point, other than the one he was living through, which was in the 1920s. But now, writing from the current vantage point, there have been 4 of these. And so that puts me in a position where I can really compare and contrast these cases in a way that Bourdieu couldn't, to get insight into some of these questions, like why do these things come about at all? When and why do they end? How does one influence the next? And stuff like this. And so I try to do that in chapter 2 of the book, but that's a contribution that I think I'm able to make from my current historical vantage point, that Bourdieu wasn't. Were he alive today, he'd probably write a book that's much better than mine. but since he's...
he would co-author, he would call you and would be like, you want to write a book together?
But as it stands, I'm trying to kind of carry forward some of the track that he laid and some of the work that he did in the 60s and 70s.
Of predictive power, like would you be able to predict when and how the 5th awakening would happen?
I spent a little time in chapter 2 kind of playing with this. So there are a few things that you could...
Political betting markets are, I want to make some money here.
So, when you look at, let's see. So they tend to be spaced out, I would say, like 30 to 40 years apart. And they each last about 10 years, although the one previous to this one was shorter. It was about half the length. And there, as I say in the book, when you compare and contrast these cases, there seem to be 2 things that really predict when an awakening will occur. The first one is that they tend to occur when you have a lot of elite overproduction. So that's when you have a lot of people who are growing up in society, and they feel entitled to an elite position because they did everything right. They went to college. They got good grades. They got a good job. They majored in the things you were supposed to major in, or whatever, right? So they did everything right, such that they would expect to live comfortable, elite lives. But the power structure just isn't able to accommodate them, to give them the status that they feel entitled to give them the lifestyle they feel entitled to. When you have these periods of elite overproduction that get really pronounced, this is the first important predictor. But elite overproduction, and so what happens then is that these are the elites who feel, these aspiring elites who feel like they're not living the lives that they should, basically start indicting the established order and the people who are running it, and saying that the existing elites need to be overthrown and replaced with people more like themselves. Basically, that's the tweet version. Okay, so an elite overproduction gives people the motive for these awakenings, but they don't necessarily have the means. And this is because, as my advisor Seamus Khan illustrated in some of his research, the fortunes of elites and non-elites tend to operate counter-cyclically. And by this, I mean times that are good times for elites tend to be kind of not good times for everyone else. But then on the flip side, times that are kind of lean and tight for elites tend to be pretty good times for everyone else. So it's hard to get people to care if the poor Ivy League, the poor descendant of Ivy League students is racking up debt and has to work a normie job like the rest of us. Like no one's going to be breaking out their little violins. And but then there are moments when these trajectories get collapsed, when things have been kind of bad and growing worse for normal people for a while, and then all of a sudden they're bad for elites too. When these two things happen at the same time, that's when you really see awakenings that happen. Because you have the conditions, you have a large-scale public discontent. A lot of the public is also frustrated with the elites, and you have these social movements that fall into kind of abeyance patterns when times are good, that start getting more traction when things get terrible. And so this kind of creates a groundwork for these frustrated elites, creates conditions for these frustrated elites to really harness popular discontent to really more forcefully shake out and mount a more significant challenge to the established people and to the way institutions are currently running and things like this.
It's different from a revolution, because as you're talking, I'm immediately thinking about like the classics, and even like Neil Ferguson developed his own version, right, in Civilization, of like the 6 things that have to coincide for there to be a revolution, right? And here you look at, I don't know, the French Revolution, and then you look at 1848, and then you look at, I don't know, the Russian Revolution, right? And like it has like supply chain problems, and a lot of young men suddenly go to college in cities, and they radicalize the intelligentsia, and they have a lot of time, right? And then there's the poor countryside, and then somehow the discontent is at different levels, and then there's this kind of combustion that happens. So I'm really curious, like, are we talking about basically bloodless revolutions here? Are we talking about symbolic revolutions? And then we will talk a little bit about symbolic everything here, but would you equate these two things?
Well, so they don't usually tend to culminate in what I would consider a revolution, which would be like a fundamental, like a profound change to how things operate and to who's in charge. Instead of that, what tends to happen is that over the course of the awakening, basically the kind of gaps between normies who are concerned about social problems and elites who are leveraging concern about those problems to enhance their own position, the kind of gaps between those groups grow wider and eventually unsustainable. And meanwhile, the kind of the people who are already successful and already flourishing try to outmaneuver the kind of upstarts and eventually try to integrate at least enough of them into the power structure to make to kind of break the back of the movement. So eventually they integrate enough of them that the movement eventually kind of fizzles out. Often by creating new jobs for elites. So you see over the course of the current awakening, for instance, you see a proliferation of new HR roles and things like this for jobs that basically help companies and other institutions conspicuously conform with the correct social justice. So, you see the proliferation of, and so eventually they integrate enough of the frustrated elites such that the people who still aspire to elite status but couldn't get it, they just don't have enough. They don't have enough other people who are on their side with the torches and pitchforks anymore. And And so the whole thing just fizzles out, and eventually they just have to reconcile themselves to living a lower standard of living than they were initially expecting. So that's how the awakenings usually end out, is that enough of the challengers get integrated into the power structure, and the gaps between the elites and the normies kind of grow wider, and so it just collapses, and rather than culminating in a revolution or a substantial change to how things work.
I also think it probably helps that we are like smarter and more peaceful and lazier and like happier and more spoiled. So we don't necessarily want to burn down our cities. We kind of want to use them. We want to continue to use them. I think the more, and this is where, capitalists win, the more stuff you have, the more you will be attached to keeping them. Whereas if you have nothing, it's much more likely that you will start a revolution or another kind of violent event. The defining term of your book and your Substack writing, and it pops up in articles where you write, and probably also your Fox News appearances, although I have to admit I don't watch it. I only just follow the cancellations, is the idea of symbolic capitalism. You're borrowing this term from Bruno Latour, if I'm not mistaken, and even the title. No, actually you borrowed it from Bourdieu, right? It's the title that comes from Latour, excuse me. So it was the great Pierre who came up with this. And there are a lot of related terms that you're introducing, which were very, very interesting to me. I don't know enough about Bourdieu to know which ones are variations on his work or which ones you're borrowing and kind of like making your own. Symbolic production versus symbolic production, symbolic industry, symbolic domination. And one of the things that you're talking about, which I have to admit, I'm still trying to fully kind of like understand how that works, which is just that kind of social justice is a defining characteristic of symbolic domination. And I'm really, really curious what the psychology and the structure is here. I'm, one of my favorite thinkers about power these days is Johannes Gershevsky, who writes about like the three pillars of power, legitimacy, corruption, and retaliation. And obviously, legitimacy is all about what good is this leader bringing us, but also why is he or she the person in charge? And maybe with symbolic systems, this is a little bit more confusing, and that would be my guess, that you have to at least pretend to care about other people so that they can leave you in power. Is this the correct way of thinking about it? Why do you think that that's the most important thing about symbolic domination? And what do you mean by this term?
Yeah, so symbolic domination is a term that Bourdieu did invent, so can't take credit for that one.
Pierre, all podcast like this would not have happened without. Thank you that we didn't have to reinvent the wheel.
What Bourdieu meant by symbolic domination was the ways that elites convince everyone else, basically, that inequalities are normal or appropriate or justified, that the people in charge should be in charge, and that the people who are suffering deserve to be suffering. So an argument of the book is that social justice discourse has increasingly been tied up with these bids for symbolic domination. So people who are knowledge economy professionals, symbolic capitalists, as I call them, they increasingly leverage social justice discourse both to justify why they deserve power and status, why they should be in charge, and also why those people who are their political adversaries, their economic adversaries, etc., don't deserve status. So for instance, people who say or think the wrong things about race or gender or sexuality, people who vote for the wrong political candidates, and so on and so forth. They deserve if they're suffering, good. They deserve their suffering, and in fact, they probably have more than they deserve. If they're overlooked and marginalized, we don't need to listen to their perspectives. Those perspectives are of no value, and so on. And the way, and the story that I tell in the book about the reason why this kind of social justice discourse got so tied up with the symbolic professions, symbolic capitalists, is that basically, it's basically a story of just historical contingency. So it could have been some other way, but just as a function of the way things played out historically, these two things got tied together. And the reason they got tied together this way is that from the beginning of the symbolic professions, a lot of symbolic capitalists have tried to justify why they should get the extraordinary pay, why other people should defer to them, why they should enjoy high social status, by claiming that they serve the good of everyone, that they're altruistic in nature, and that especially they take care of the least among us. So for instance, journalists, from the beginning of the journalism profession, journalists are supposed to be a voice for the voiceless, and they're supposed to hold the powerful to account and speak truth to power, and so on and so forth. Academics are supposed to follow the truth wherever it leads without regards to whether it serves anyone's financial interests or political interests, and so on and so forth. So the idea is that we deserve the kind of, you should give us status, you should give us power, because if you do, everyone will be better off because of all the good work that we do for everyone else. Because we don't need the status for our sake. We need it to help us do the good work for everyone else. And the money that you give us that allows us to live comfortable lives is what's necessary to allow us to do the important work that we're doing, and so on. This has been the way that we've justified ourselves from the beginning, from the foundation of these careers. Doctors, lawyers, you name it. And
basically like buying legitimacy, right? You're buying legitimacy in an environment where the stakes are relatively low other than your job. Like
yeah.
this, other people of whether a symbolic leader is in power or another symbolic leader is almost negligible. It reminds me of like, I don't know if you've had this experience, but like, I like to say that hard jobs always have amazing colleagues. Like when I was poor immigrant and worked in catering and customer service, and like I was a night editor and I was working from like deep into the night or deep into the morning, basically on breaking news, all the colleagues were amazing because the work is super hard. So you need each other. And also it's very clear to tell who's good and who's not, because if somebody sucks at their job, we all suffer and have to cover for them. But when I moved up the ladder and I became a symbolic asshole, right, like everybody else, and I got like good jobs, suddenly everybody's terrible at work and it's all like backstabby and political and everybody's sucking up to everybody. And I just like churned out so fast, like, advertising agencies, editorial room, stuff like that, because almost anybody could be there with a degree. So you have to really kind of like worm your way around to like, it's a horrible way. Like, whenever you want to look at like the morality of a hierarchy, look at like who gets to lead, like who rises in that hierarchy and what is their morality, and you will know everything about what the values are that work, right? And it's always work high prestige stuff.
Well, and the college degree thing, you said anyone with a degree, and this is important, is this is one of the primary functions that degrees serve today, and degree requirements for jobs serve today, is to basically restrict competition for those jobs to the people with the right backgrounds. And this is why degree requirements were created in the first place. So if you look at most jobs that require degrees, oftentimes you can have a degree in anything. And you can have a degree in fashion or chemistry or physics, and it doesn't matter. And even if you have a degree in something that's relevant for the job, you often don't end up using, in particular, anything you learned in class in the job. You actually end up learning the job while you do the job. And in principle, anyone else, even who didn't go to college, could learn the job in the same way and do the job. And so what the degree requirements do is they restrict competition. So that allows, that both helps mitigate the elite overproduction issue in the sense that, it helps mitigate it in some conditions and it makes it worse in others. But it helps mitigate it in the sense that it reduces the number of people who are competing for these elite positions. But then it can make it worse because when you have just a bigger and bigger share of American society going to college and graduating to college. And everyone who goes to college has this expectation that if you get the degree, you're entitled to a certain standard of life. Then it can end up being a double-edged sword.
It's so much money for it in America, right? Like in Europe, no, here it's also like you invested into, like you invested a year's salary into a bachelor, just like you want to get it back.
And years of your life, right? And so it feels like a social contract that's broken. If you did everything right, if you went into debt and you spent all of these years studying this stuff so you could get this piece of paper, and then at the end of the day, it's like, oh, well, I'm glad you have these pieces of paper. Hopefully they keep you warm on the streets. Then it feels like a social contract was broken, right?
Movies get wrong, because in the movies it's always like, oh, like there are these highly coveted jobs, like Whiplash and Devil Wears Prada, and that really young girls would kill to have your job. But no, it's like anybody could, like, it's so competitive because anybody could do it. That's why it's so competitive, because extremely hard jobs are not that competitive. When I first became a boss, I thought, oh my God, everybody will try to topple me. Like nobody will want me to be a CEO of a company. And then you realize like, no, but nobody wants to be CEO. Like it's really hard. It's not competitive. The competitive stuff is the fun part in some ways, right? And the symbolic stuff is competitive.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and it's competitive. Like part of the reason there's so many reasons that these jobs are desirable. So not only do you have good pay, good prestige, and I mean good pay. Even the people who are like relatively low paid symbolic capitalists, as I show in the book, people like, for instance, contingent faculty members in academia, even full-time contingent faculty members in academia are exploited. They make just a fraction of what professors make. They have a lot less control over their jobs. They have basically no say in faculty governance decisions. It's not great. But it's also the case that full-time contingent faculty members, tend to, on average, still make much more. Students tend to make more than a typical American worker. And on top of that, they have much better working conditions. I mean, your job as a contingent faculty member, a full-time job, is you get to teach classes that you pick typically as a contingent faculty member from a range of ones that are available. You pick the ones that you want to teach. And then you stand in the front of a room a few times a week and to talk about stuff that you find interesting, that and then you eventually and you grade some people's papers, right? This isn't a job where you're putting your life and health at risk when you're, exposed to the elements and putting yourself under extreme physical strain or something like that, right? So this is a cushy job. Even at the low end, even the terrible academic jobs are still pretty cushy compared to the kinds of jobs that normal people work.
Like bullshit.
Yeah.
Is that a book that you accept as correct?
Oh, the bullshit jobs. Yeah, I mean, so Graeber is absolutely one of Graeber's points is that part of what feeds into the tensions between knowledge economy people and everyone else is this understanding that we hold in our minds, that we try to suppress as much as possible, that the work that we do really doesn't matter much, a lot of it. So for instance, if aliens came and unleashed an electromagnetic pulse that eliminated the bottom 95% of all academic research publications, no one would know the difference. Most academic studies that get published are read by only a handful of people. They're never cited, except by the author themselves, maybe. And if they never existed, no one would know the difference. And the same thing is true.
Don't tell.
And the same thing is true of so many other symbolic economy outputs. And this is different from, like, if mechanics didn't exist, or plumbers didn't exist, or people weren't making food or serving food or stocking grocery shelves, we would notice that immediately. We would society couldn't function without those people. And this awareness that what we do at the end of the day pales in comparison is not really important in the way that people serving as electricians is important, or people serving as nannies is important. This kind of awareness that what we do at the end of the day is kind of bullshit, is one of these things that creates resentment in us. And it creates resentment on the other side as well, because people who have normie jobs also sense that a lot of what we do is bullshit. And they resent the fact that we get so much more pay than them. We get so much more status than them. And on top of it, we look down and mock and deride them. When, again, like if they didn't do what they do, none of us could function. If we didn't do what we do, you'd be hard pressed to know the difference. So that's on that level, I do agree a lot with that aspect of Graeber's argument. Yeah.
I mean, I was very, very taken. I didn't know the symmetrical anthropology idea that you're mentioning from Latour, which is, if I understand correctly, it's to utilize the same methodologies that we would use on some tribe that we are kind enough to monitor without their consent and write about them and publish naked photographs, maybe to do that on our own society. You have this very poignant line. I don't know. I don't remember if it's in the book or in the Substack, but something where you basically say that symbolic capitalist domination uses these shrouding terms to not have to face some unpalatable truths, right? And what are these truths? And would there be a way of talking productively, to use your own kind of distinction here, and not symbolically about them? And would the current elites even be credible sources of this information? Or would we need to, because, I mean, what is more kind of dissonant than when symbolic leaders now choose a real person to present their problem? And for our podcast listeners, I'm doing like air quotation marks right now. That's somehow even worse, right? I don't know.
Yeah, there's kind of a tokenism.
I don't know if you've ever been talking on a panel. I have. And then you're like, okay, great. So I'm just like representing 4 billion women here with all their experiences and lives. I don't know if I'm qualified for that. So what are these unpalatable truths that I think probably propelled you to write this book and be a little bit off that we don't get to talk about them? When you tried yourself, you got canceled and lost your job. So you have pretty good firsthand like proof that this is a possibility. And what would be a way to allow our fellow humans to voice these and not get in trouble?
Yeah. So, I mean, again, one example of a difficult reality that we do try to suppress, that we are aware of at times, is again the relative value of the work that we do relative to everyone else, and the fact that and the fact that basically people are not being compensated according to the value that they produce. So laborers who do these other who work producing physical goods and delivering physical services that we couldn't live without don't make a lot, and people who work jobs that we could definitely do without make a whole lot and enjoy a lot of social prestige. There's something wrong with that, but the only way to fix that would be to reallocate resources and prestige away from people like us and towards normal workers. And so that's one example. Another example is that when you look at who actually benefits from inequality, so who are the winners in the prevailing order? At the end of the day, even though symbolic capitalists tend to be committed to social justice, even though we're the Americans who are most likely to self-identify as anti-racist or feminists or environmentalists or allies to LGBTQ people, etc. When you look at our lifestyles and our modes of social arrangement, when you look at who actually benefits from and perpetuates a lot of the inequalities and other social problems, we're among the primary beneficiaries. Even when people talk about the millionaires and the billionaires, as I show in chapter 3 of the book, how do the millionaires and the billionaires do the things they do? It's mostly with and through us. So there are people who are criticizing Amazon for developing these cages for workers in the warehouses who designed those cages? It wasn't Jeff Bezos. It was some middle management functionary person who was trying to increase the numbers a little bit so they can climb up the ladder. Or Anand Giridharadas has a great book called Winners Take All, which is about how millionaires and billionaires present themselves as the solutions to the problems that they create. Okay, who helps them launder their reputations? Who's working in the PR firms? Who's creating and running the nonprofits? Who's helping them launder their money and stuff like that? It's us. You really can't explain anything that people don't like about the social order without looking at us. And we don't like to do that. We like to look at other people, either, again, the people who are actually the losers in the prevailing order, the people who are not flourishing, who are suffering. We either blame them for social problems, even though they have a lot less control over things than we do, or again, on the other end, we look at the billionaires and so on. Even though, again, even when you want to look at the billionaires, if you actually pay concrete attention to how the billionaires do the things they do, it's with us and through us. And so these are some examples of the fundamental tension that I think kind of defines the symbolic professions is that a lot of us are committed to being egalitarians. Like, we sincerely do want the oppressed to be liberated, the poor to be uplifted, and all of this. Like, it's not cynical, but we also have this other very sincere desire and set of commitments that we want to be elites. We want to live better than most other people. We want to enjoy deference, a higher status. We want our children to reproduce our own social position or do even better than us. And these two drives, which are both sincere, are completely incompatible. You can't be an egalitarian social climber. You can't be an elite and a man of the people. These are two things that are, these are two drives that are just in fundamental tension. And that tension has kind of defined the symbolic professions from the beginning, and continues to define them today. And the problem is, the only way to really resolve that tension at bottom would be for us to either change or modify our aspirations, or be willing to reconcile, or be willing to reallocate resources and opportunities and stuff away from us and towards people who are genuinely disadvantaged. And I think everyone, if you ask a symbolic capitalist, they all say, sure, I support that in principle. I support that for, in fact, everyone who's not me should definitely allocate opportunities to other people, and they should definitely make profound sacrifices and all of this kind of stuff. But of course, when it comes to my own children, or myself, or something like that, you know.
Well, what is your take on EA? Do you have a take? Effective altruism?
Yeah, I mean, so in some ways, effective altruism. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Like trying to hack this kind of inbuilt contradiction within the new class of elites, right?
Yeah. Although in some ways, EA is kind of a poster child for some of the things I talked about in the book, you know, with Sam Bankman-Fried, in his quest to do this kind of hacking, ended up taking, you know, a lot of these legal and ethically problematic decisions, defrauding a lot of people, living a very comfortable, luxurious life himself, and you know, doing less than could be done with those same resources and opportunities and things like this. I do think the some virtues of the EA movement is, for instance, they tend to be strong proponents of just cash transfers. So instead of having symbolic capitalists where other middlemen try to determine what's best for people under the assumption that we know better, just give people money and let them. And and there's actually a lot of evidence
that's Christmas. For those of you wondering, it's great. It's just give people money.
Well, it tends to work better because even the kind of most nerdy even the most committed and careful researchers who are trying to understand what other people might want or need, don't have the same kinds of fine-grained information that people that, that people themselves have about what their needs are and stuff like this. And often we resist giving money to poor people because we operate under this implicit assumption, sometimes explicit actually, that the reason those people are poor is because they don't make good decisions. So it could be that the reason people are making decisions that we think of as bad is because they're poor, is because they don't have access to money and opportunities and resources. And so this pushes them into this kind of privation and uncertainty and stuff like this pushes them into making decisions that we think of as problematic. Or it could just be that those are fundamentally deficient people. And so no matter what you do for them, they're just going to make bad decisions unless you're without your steady hand kind of guiding them down the right path. So oftentimes, symbolic capitalists assume the second thing. We assume that we're just better than most other people, and most other people, without our guiding beneficent hands, would just make terrible decisions. But it turns out, when you just give people money, it tends to actually work better than a lot of the finely tuned kind of top-down government or nonprofit administrator things where we're trying to guide people. There's actually kind of a nice middle ground where you can give people money and also provide them with training and stuff like this, and that tends to work even better. But giving people money is actually pretty hard to beat. And so I credit effective altruism actually with trying to encourage that. Just give people money and let them, so you people who have money more than you need, give it to other people who don't have that money and let them figure it out. So that I think is a positive.
But like in my life, there are definitely examples for this, right? I mean, I will give you one example, and I was, not necessarily the third world country level of deprivation, but at some point in my life when I was 30, I lost everything. So I had my whole life, I was an adult, I had a name, I had an apartment, the boyfriend, the car, some fame in a completely different country, and then something terrible happened in my life and I lost everything. And I started my life from zero in a completely different country. And I remember there was like this one kind of inflection point in 2018 when I was 34 and 35 years old. And two important things were given to me in that year. It's like almost like a mathematical exercise or a little fairy tale. One, I got into a startup incubator in London that gave you space and contacts and training, everything but cash. This was not personal, that's just their system. And the other thing, somebody just wired money into my account. Like literally I got a friendly gift from somebody who thought I was smart. And this person wired $2,000 into my bank account, which I could not believe it. Like at the time, $2,000 to me was like half a year of like shift work and like an insane amount of money. And this was very recently. And because he was like, you have to go to San Francisco because you have to talk to people who don't care about, troubled women from Eastern Europe recovering from bullshit. They are like, you have good ideas. And there are people who don't care. And, it's true, in fact, only about very specific people in San Francisco, not the whole elite system there. That's another matter. And I literally got on a plane, went there, and the first person I met, and this was my first time in America, like I'm 35 years old, and I arrived, and the first meeting I had, basically, that person became my first investor. 3 days later, Interintellect, which was like a hobby that I was doing whilst working night jobs in London. And I always think about it, but we're like, oh, I should. No, like for some people, like you want to give $2,000 to people who will then just immediately do something useful with it, right? Yeah. And I think that the amount of people like that there are is just unbelievably greater.
Yes. Yeah.
But you could look at a person and be like, oh, well, I actually was told, like, oh, if she was smart, she would already be successful at 35. And no, you don't know what happened. You don't know about a person.
Absolutely. And this is another thing I credit EA with, actually, is widening the lens, so that rather than just focusing on one's own country, looking at people who, because sometimes this donation of $200 or something like that can make a much bigger difference, can go much, much further if you give someone outside the United States that $200 compared to someone in the United States. And so in terms of widening the lens and expanding the range of opportunities, helping people's dollars go further, in terms of expanding other people's prospects and opportunities and things like this, I think is also a thing that I would credit EA with. Although, again, there's a lot that I would criticize about the movement in general, but
a little bit unsymbolic. And you value that, however that worked out for some. That's so interesting to me. Okay. So, and also, like, as you were talking about cancel culture, I kept thinking that this is basically like Stalinism in some weird symbolic way with all these purges. Like, you keep like shredding off everything until basically nothing remains. And Anne Applebaum writes about this beautifully in The Iron Curtain, which kind of is unreadable today because it reminds you so much of the present day, where after everybody has been killed off, including the leader's sons, and it's like a complete biblical level cataclysm, what they do is they pick earlier sinners and put them in charge in all the satellite states. So actually, it's not the true believer leading Czechoslovakia and whatever. It's somebody who, Applebaum writes beautifully about like ex-Nazi, closeted homosexual, like somebody where we have something on you and you will be more loyal going forward. And I'm so worried that we will reach that stage in cancel culture where we reinstate people, but we have something on them. By we, I mean the canceling is, and it turns into a kind of blackmail so that you behave yourself.
Well, one thing that's interesting, so it is definitely the case that, okay, so there are two things that are interesting. So one of them is, and I do mention this briefly in, I think, chapter 2 of the book, that when you look at who are the most ardent supporters of Stalinism, of Maoism, and so on and so forth, it was symbolic capitalists. It was symbolic capitalists that pretty much.
Awesome. Okay. Sorry, and
pretty much all of these contexts where you have these kinds of ideologically oppressive systems and the purges and the witch hunts, all of that, it's the same strata of people leading them as no matter what. And that's really interesting and distressing. Okay. And then for reasons that I talk about in the book, because the kinds of people gravitate.
So, this is how a new book is born. We've just.
Well, it's for reasons that I talk about a little bit in the book, is that these professions do tend to pull in people who are systematically different from most other people in a lot of ways. People who are more symbolic, the people who become symbolic capitalists tend to be more ideological, more ideologically extreme, more conformist, and so on and so forth compared to most other people. And so the institutions actually select for these kinds of people for all sorts of reasons. One of them being the requirements for degrees, and especially degrees from fancy schools. So when you look at who is most likely to graduate from, like, how do you end up getting a degree from a school like Harvard? Well, that's someone typically who showed up to class every day and on time, who performed their assignments in accordance with what the instructor wanted, to detail, who really took pride in what their professors thought of them, who didn't have the wrong kinds of disciplinary activities, but did have the right kinds of extracurricular activities, made sure that they said exactly the right things on their college statements and stuff like this. And so, a preference for people who graduate from Harvard is a preference for people who are highly conscientious conformists, basically. And we don't have this impression of ourselves. We look at when you work for Google, it's like there's not a lot of structure and there's total freedom in how you structure your time and all of this. But the truth is, the reason why we have that freedom is because you don't have to surveil us. We surveil ourselves intensely. We kind of manage we try to outproduce,
Do you see this in academia as well? Like, do you see this? Because Stony Brook has more of a kind of rebellious reputation, no? But do you see any? Do you sometimes have to like encourage your own students to think a little bit more outside the box?
Well, sure. Well, again, I think one of the big pressures that a lot of students are under is that they really feel this this need to do and say the right thing and make sure that they have the right credentials and make sure that and in fact you see this big difference. I talk to people a lot about privately, not so much publicly yet, so here it goes. About the
part of the podcast behind a paywall. Just 2 minutes here.
Yeah. About the vast difference between students at Columbia and students at community college. So at community college, you have a lot of people who are taking classes just because they're interested in them. They don't have a 5-year plan. They don't know how it all fits together. You have this mix of people, military veterans, retirees who are lifelong learners, people just out of high school, and so on and so on. And they're just there taking the things because, and maybe they hope that this will culminate in a degree, and the degree will be useful, but they don't have, and as a consequence of not having that same kind of polished plan or persona or whatever, in those classes, people are actually a lot more willing to kind of explore things. That's why they're there. It's just because it's interesting, and they're epistemically humble and curious. Like they understand that they don't know everything, and so on. At Columbia, completely different vibe. So those the students that are all very bright, they're very good at studenting. That's why they're there. But they're also kind of like arrows. The students are like arrows. Like they have a clear vision of what they're trying to accomplish, and almost everything that they do and say is kind of in the service of this plan that they have to get their job at Goldman Sachs. Like they're gonna take these classes, and this will improve their resume in this way so that they can get this job. And like everything that they say is almost everything that they say is like very careful and guarded and a lot more cautious. They're really concerned about their self-presentation. They self-censor a lot more, and because a lot seems to be at stake. A lot more seems to be at stake in all of these interactions, and they're acutely aware when you're at a school like Columbia, kind of how hard it is to.
I can't imagine you there. So that our viewers can't see your big gestures that you do when you're on the stage IRL. So we did the Future of Publishing Festival with Interintellect, and you have these operatic sessions that I feel like video is too reductive for you. But like what did you do in this? Like you don't seem like an arrow. What did you do when you were at Columbia? You just scandalized people? You were like, will be canceled on Fox News. Just wait.
Well, I wasn't an arrow, but I did learn how to play the game. So the first time I applied to grad school, actually I didn't get in anywhere. And then the second time I applied to grad school, I got in. I only aimed at elite schools, but I got in everywhere. I got into Yale. I got into Columbia. So I learned how to play the game, and I played the game, and that's how I got there. Just like everybody else. But then also, I'm a little bit, the fact that I'm unusual, but also high achieving or whatever, that I come from this kind of unusual background, people like me actually serve an important system in the whole legitimation scheme that Columbia does, right? Because you actually need, in order for the rich kids who go there to feel like they deserve what the position that they hold and that they're meritocratic and they're there because they're the best and the brightest, you actually need some people who came up from community college or from unusual backgrounds and who are achieving great things. Like having people like me helps those the more typical Columbia student also feel like they're scrappy bootstrappers who are meritocratic and all of this. And so just me being there doing the thing that I did is like I serve an important role for Columbia University for the rich kids, and I also help enrich their experiences, and I mean through the diversity that I'm bringing, and so on and so forth. That's why I'm there. It's because I'm useful, and I was never under any illusions about that. Is that I'm there because I'm useful, and so I just tried to be useful.
What's the most surprising part of the game that you had to learn to play that surprised you? Where you were like, okay, guys, if you want this, I will do it, but I have no idea why.
Yeah, I mean, so I talk a little bit about this in the book, that this whole leaning into adversity and disadvantage and stuff like this, oftentimes people who are from kind of non-traditional elite circles struggle to tell these kinds of stories because the things they've gone to are often kind of shameful to them. They're not proud of having suffered under poverty, or they're not proud of having been victimized by someone in their family, or they're not proud of that. They wouldn't go, first thing hi, I don't know you at all, but let me tell you about my childhood trauma, right? Like, that's not the way that normal people think or talk. And then even to the extent that they recognize it might be useful to tell these kinds of narratives instead of it being kind of sick and shameful. even when they recognize that it would be useful to them to tell these kinds of narratives, they often tell the wrong kind of story. So when they tell the story about how they got from where they started to where they are, they talk about things like lucky breaks, or the other people who helped them along the way, or things like, or social conditions that, they don't tell this kind of heroic bootstrapping story about how their grit and determination and so on and so forth. And that's what elite gatekeepers are looking for. They want stories of people who rose to the bottom, from the bottom to the top, but still keep it real and plan on paying it forward as a result of their deep meritocratic, their kind of, and so learning that was
So you had to learn the symbolic storytelling to explain your future legitimacy in the elite.
Not only did I have to learn how to do that, I had to make peace with doing that. So, I had to make peace with a lot of things.
And there's a book to prove that you didn't make peace with.
Yeah, so I guess the book is in some ways a kind of me struggling with this. So it's the case, for instance, that even this book, if I had been a cisgender heterosexual Christian white male who tried to write this book, there's no way it would have gotten published. If I was at University of North Dakota and I tried to write this book, there's no way it would have gotten published. Certainly not by Princeton University Press. The reason Princeton University Press published this book is because I am a scholar who checks the right kind of boxes coming from an Ivy League school. That's just a fact, right? If I wasn't a Black Muslim sociologist at Columbia, the book would have been a lot less appealing, or would have seemed a lot more risky to the publishers. The fact that I'm a Black person, a Muslim who's been canceled by Fox News, gives me a lot more latitude to talk about a lot of these issues. I don't face the same kinds of immediate criticisms that if I were a white person talking about these issues, immediately people would impugn my motives when I'm talking about, when I'm offering challenging perspectives on race, for instance. If you offer those same perspectives as a white person, people will call you a racist. No one's going to call me a racist. And the same thing again, as a Muslim, as someone who's been canceled by Fox News, as a non-traditional, as a person of a non-traditional background for the kind of work that I do. All of this enables me to write a kind of book like this that other people wouldn't be able to write. They literally wouldn't be given social permission to write this book. Publishers would never publish a book, the same book by those people. And so there's a sense in which the book is critical of a lot of these symbolic capitalism, but it's also a product of these very things. If it weren't for the fact that I'm a Black Muslim from a non-traditional background who was tied to an Ivy League school, this book wouldn't exist. It wouldn't exist. And this is a thing that, again, I have to make peace with, even as I'm criticizing it.
But it's so thought-provoking, at least it is to me, that, as I look at your life and your career, all I see is contradictions, and they are very generative and interesting or interest-creating contradictions. Black, Muslim, but military family, Afghanistan. You want to be a Catholic priest. Being a business person, being community college, Ivy League, like all these things. And yet the contradiction that troubles you the most is this one. That's what you write a book about, because this hurts in a different way, right? We have personal hardship, and we all have, contradictions in our kind of categories where we confuse people. We don't know how to fit in. I mean, I definitely have it. All the people that I know who are to any degree interesting have, they seem like a very well-functioning composite of 15 different people that should not ever exist in the form of one, but somehow it makes sense. But it's not even you say contradiction in the subtitle, but I feel, or if you're in any way like me about this, like it's the lie that bothers you.
Yeah.
Something there that is a lie and that creates complicity, and we feel too small to resist it, right? You're there in a conversation, you feel your kind of blood freezing because the other person is kind of like reading from a prompter, and you're like, is this sincere? Because if it is sincere, it's even worse than if I, because then they have been brainwashed. And talk about helplessness, right? That's something where you will have a moral crisis and sit down and write a book. I mean, that's why I started the Hope Axis, right? I was sitting in the room listening to people, and I felt in every cell of my body that this is not true. That this is not that I'm like disagreeing that I have different values or I read different papers, is that people are speaking with their mouths for a specific purpose that I understand, but what they are saying is not true. But I paid for this shit. I'm standing here and I'm not leaving. Now what? What does that make me?
Yeah. Well, so this is why I called the book We Have Never Been Woke instead of You Have Never Been Woke. It's because I wanted to, it's the fact that, and here Latour's work is very useful, this kind of the symmetrical anthropology, this kind of reflexive attitude, this reflexive approach to studying social problems is useful for helping me also work through this profound tension that, again, I recognize a lot of these problems with what I call totemic capitalism, and I criticize them and I try to draw attention to them, but I wouldn't even be able to do that if it weren't for the fact that I'm also playing this game, which allows me to,
stranger character. So Bruno Latour wrote this book called We Have Never Been Modern, right? And basically try to reawaken the Parisian elites that they are in fact caveman. I'm like, really, this is like the book in a tweet, an old tweet where it was only like 140 characters, and to kind of like slap them back into life a little bit, to look at themselves in more honesty.
Kind of. Yeah. So he was arguing absolutely that the kinds of stories that people that moderns tell themselves about what separates them from everyone else, about what makes them unique, and all these stories themselves obscured the nature of the modern world. They were not true. Not only were they not true per se, but they actually made it harder for us to see the truth. They shielded from us uncomfortable realities about the way the world operated, and they made it more difficult for us to actually respond to the problems of modernity. And so in a similar way, I argue that the stories that symbolic capitalists tell ourselves about how we're advocates for the marginalized and the disadvantaged, about how we're on the right side of history, and so on and so forth, these stories that we tell ourselves prevent us from actually seeing who benefits from the social order and how. It prevents us from understanding why it is that racialized inequalities persist or gendered inequalities persist, and who benefits from them and what we can do about them. because the answers to those questions are not comfortable for us. And but if we actually do, and I think again that most of us do truly want to solve some of these problems, or make progress on them to the best extent available.
Yes, resolve it and to like cheer them on, right?
And
At least see somebody else resolve them and cheer them on.
yeah, ideally, yes, ideally what we would like to do is solve these problems without making sacrifices or without personally changing our own lifestyles and aspirations, without personally making deep, profound sacrifices. So if there's a way that's kind of the holy grail. But unfortunately, that's not possible. It's just not possible to, for instance, just tax Elon Musk. If we just tax Elon Musk enough, we'll solve all of these problems. Now, the billionaires should pay more taxes. I don't have a problem with that. But the idea that we can just tax the billionaires and solve all of these problems is a mistake for a number of reasons, not the least of them being that even if we tax the billionaires, the people who end up administering that money then are us. And as I show in the book, when you look at the time that that a lot of these professions were created, there was this massive reallocation of wealth. The income tax was established. There was the creation of all these nonprofits. There was a significant transfer of wealth from the Gilded Age elites downwards. But when you look at who actually benefited, where did the wealth go? It mostly went from the rich to the upper middle class. We mostly took from the rich and gave to ourselves. And so this is the real big problem with thinking that we'll just tax Elon Musk and somehow solve poverty, is because when we tax Elon Musk, it's going to be people like us who are in charge of distributing that money. And the idea that we'll just distribute all of that money to the people who need it most, taking nothing from ourselves, not in any way enhancing the own position of our own communities and our own families and serving our own interests, is a fantasy, because we're humans. And so this is part of the dilemma. And the other part of the dilemma is that with just focusing on the billionaires, is that it's definitely true that the top 1% owns this radically disproportionate share of wealth, but they don't own the majority. If you want to understand who owns the majority of wealth, you have to look at the top. If you look at the top 20% of Americans, they control 72% of all the wealth in the country. They have a hugely disproportionate share. And it's, as Richard Reeves showed in his book, Dream Workers, it's actually a lot of the actions by people in the upper middle class to try to enhance their own position and protect their own position and help their children be as good as them or better off. It's actually these kinds of moves by the upper middle class that are most responsible for the declines in social mobility, for creating this situation, this stagnation, this freezing. We've created, as he calls it, in our efforts to create kind of glass floors for ourselves and for our children. We've been preventing other people from being able to kind of rise up. We've prevented a lot of innovation and churn and stuff that would need to happen to have a dynamic economy where people can.
And we know we have the clergy and the military, right? I mean, the military only in peacetime, but the clergy is a kind of symbolic power, right? I mean, all the monastic orders, I mean, not in all religions, but definitely in Catholicism, perform the good deeds also as a way of like justifying the fact that they are just otherwise singing and reading books all day, right?
Yes.
And on donations, right? So in exchange, they would like grow herbs and administer to the ailing and whatever. And I mean, in 19th century France, from which we derive a lot of contemporary sociological ideas still, you had Stendhal, you have the rouge and noir, the red and the black, right? Red being the military and black being the clergy. You have wayward sons, zero social mobility into symbolic systems. But what is your personality? Do you want to fight or do you want to read? Nerds going to the clergy, aggressive disciplinary problem boys into the military, and then they will figure it out what to do with them. And we know down. And, when people are talking like, oh, we need to bring back religiousness because blah, 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 for people's psychological comfort, I'm like, that's not just what is lost. It's these routes. So how come that we had drastically more unequal social systems, almost unimaginably to a contemporary person? Like when somebody dreams about the 19th century, I'm like, just go back for one day and see for yourself how people lived, right? But nevertheless, in those systems, and maybe because of all the deprivation, there were these saving routes for some people where you could literally sacrifice your life, right, in one way or another, to your fertility or your actual physical existence as an individual, but it got you out from where you were.
Yeah. Well,
maybe sports in America, right? Like sports scholarships, like there are some. Yoga influencing on Instagram. What is the way out today?
Yeah. Well, in general, there is a lot less dynamism in the economy, dynamism in terms of opportunities, especially since the shift to the symbolic economy in the 1970s. There's been what some have called the Great Stagnation, but Americans, the kind of social mobility and kind of churn has slowed down. Innovation has slowed down. People have become less mobile. They're kind of both in terms of class, like mobile, but then also in terms of just where you live and the kind of the. So it used to be the case that people could like move to a community.
That's that it's slowed down, right? Like it defies all logic in some sense.
Yeah, and it defies our own self-understanding of the kinds of transformations that, say, technology would empower, or the kinds of innovations and opportunities that that shifting to a meritocratic and ostensibly meritocratic system would, and so on. So a lot of the stories we tell ourselves about the kind of society we're creating and the kind of society we're presiding over are just incompatible with the realities of how our societies have been operating since we've had more and more power. And so this is one of the things that I hope the book helps people see, is that there is this, we do tell ourselves these stories, but we haven't created the kind of world that we said we would. If anything, we've created something, we're maybe moving in the opposite direction.
I don't know how much you're familiar with the hope axis idea, but one of the gripes I had when I was, thinking about this new system, where I basically lay out my observation that when internet started, the past 10 years were all about wokes versus conservatives, right? Wokes say that the past was bad, and then some wokes think that there is redemption, some wokes think that there isn't any, and then it's just done. And then conservatives think that the past was imperfect, but altogether good, and there are things worth preserving and integrating into life. Disruption for disruption's sake is a sin. And I found that, a year ago or so, that there's another axis that seems to be more in our faces, which is public nostalgics versus what I call the autistic culture. I'm using this term from other people. This is, I give them credit in a Creative Commons way. Public nostalgics, the future will be bad, period. Right? Whatever, the past was good, but the future will be bad. Like that's more important even than the past. And the autist culture posits that the future will be good. And then something that, it's going to be good if you and I work really hard, like that's me, right? And something, some are like indefinite optimists who think like somebody will figure, like technology will save us somehow, somebody will come. And I found that your book to me is very pro-future. It's not, if anything, it holds the past deeply accountable for the mess we're in. And you're not dreaming yourself back into previous incarnations of this situation. You're like, and through these 4 stages, and it's getting worse. It's like, let's work on the future. What's the hope of your book?
Yeah, I mean, I have an article that's coming out soon for Deseret magazine that really underscores this point about how. So, for instance, at the time my father was growing up, at the time my father was a young man, segregation was still a thing. Actual segregation was still a thing. And even until 1973 in the United States. So the Brown versus the Board of Education desegregated the public schools, the K-12 schools, but colleges remained segregated perfectly legally in 19 states all the way until 1973 with Adams v. Richardson. And so someone of my father's generation would have had a hard time even kind of envisioning a kind of life that I lead, where I went to an Ivy League school. I have a PhD from an Ivy League school. I teach at a top research university as a tenure-line professor. I write regularly for the New York Times and the Washington Post and all of this kind of stuff. Like, that kind of horizon wasn't even like a realistic thing for most Black men of my father's generation. But my own kids take for granted that this kind of a thing is perfectly fine. We've had Black president of the United States at this point, right? And so on and so forth. And that's not nothing. The difference between the kind of world that my father grew up in and the kind of world that my kids are growing up in is not nothing. And in fact, one of the things that infuriates me a little bit, honestly, on this point about how much shift there has been, is that people of my father's generation, in order to just do something like marry someone who was a different race than yourself, or eat in the same establishment as white people or whatever, they had to face fire hoses and dogs and mobs and things like this. But how did they respond? Right? They responded by trying to kind of model the right way to be. They tried to take a moral high ground, and they kept being persistent. They didn't give up. They didn't let themselves be defeated. And so when I see kids at elite campuses, at elite college campuses, saying that they're like traumatized and victimized by something like a statue or a building being named the wrong thing, or some kind of, or microaggressions or something like that, to the point where they can't go on, they can't, or when I hear people saying that basically nothing, it's all the same, like, today it's the same as slavery times, it's just slavery by a new name and stuff like this. It infuriates me a little bit, honestly, and it seems like disrespectful, frankly, to the sacrifices and the work and the effort that so many have put in to make the life that we live today possible. And when I look forward, so I wouldn't want to go, and you wouldn't want to go back. I mean, even like a lot of as I've explored in some of my work, there's this kind of narrative today, for instance, that concern for things like DEI, it has destroyed meritocracy or whatever. But the truth of the matter is, meritocracy and DEI kind of arose together before the Civil Rights Acts and Title IX and things like this. Hiring and promotion was also super identity based. It was only straight white men who were allowed to work in a lot of jobs. Like someone who was something else couldn't even apply, couldn't be taken seriously. And so it was definitely the case that when only straight white men could work in these jobs, no one discussed identity when they were trying to think about hiring and promotion, because what was there to discuss? And so this question about who gets to become, say, a college professor, on what basis, that question only becomes a live question in the first place after these fields started to be opened up. And it was at that time that you started seeing the shift to focusing on meritocratic hiring. So, for instance, jobs in academia used to not even be competitive. People would literally just give jobs to people in their network who they liked in a non-competitive way. It wasn't until the 1990s, that colleges were officially required to list academic jobs that were open and do open searches for them. Until the 1990s, you could just give a tenure-line job to someone in your network. Just give it. And so hiring today, despite all of the problems, all of the things that people want to criticize, hiring today in academia, for instance, is more metrics focused than ever. It's more merit based in terms of looking at their publications and their credentials and all of that kind of stuff. It's more open and transparent than ever, and it's more competitive than ever in ways that are often bad. Like people are literally killing them,
And the job still kind of goes to the person that this person wanted to hire anyway.
Yeah, so it's not, and so it's far from perfect, to put it mildly, but it's much better than it was in the past, right? You wouldn't want to.
1990, I had no idea. That's why.
Yeah, no one does, and so
much about like the secret history and whatnot. Like, how did these people get these jobs? Oh my God.
Yeah, and so, I feel in general, part of what I'm hoping to do with this book, part of the work of this book, is to, in terms of highlighting the things that are going wrong and the ways that symbolic capitalists are contributing to these social problems, and the ways that our own commitments to social discourse and the ways we talk about social justice, the ways that these block us from understanding reality properly. The whole reason why I'm doing this, the thing that I'm hoping comes out of it, is for us to be able to think collectively about, what else we could be doing instead. I do feel it is kind of forward-looking in that way, future-looking, future-oriented, and in my own way, it's. I think some people will find it kind of bleak reading at points, but it's
in Eastern Europe. It will be a beach read. We've read this year. Big in Poland is really, really important for books that are not just warm and fuzzy feelings. But it's very, to close, I always ask my guests. So obviously, you're a sociologist, so you can see the future, right? Because you do statistics. That's everybody knows that. So, okay. So it's year 2030, and you look back on 2024. So you look back across this 6-year span. What is something that will be obvious to everybody in 2030, but few know yet?
Okay, that's really tough. That's a tough question for me because precisely because the work I do is so focused on knowledge, and I'm really paranoid about predictions and really acutely aware of the limitations of our predictive capabilities. So let's think. One thing that I think, well, this is already starting to be the case, but I think it will be just taken for granted as common wisdom. By 2030, it should be pretty clear, is that a lot of the social justice-oriented activism that was tied to the Great Awakening was not only not helpful in moving and improving a lot of the problems that we're concerned with, but also created a lot of problems that we'll have to deal with for a little while. So for instance, there's the eroded trust in expertise and in institutions that is in some part created by the fact that the distance between us and other people grew a lot over the last 10 years and also became more salient because people like us became a lot more militant about criticizing and demonizing and trying to silence and censor and punish people who diverge from our. And so these kinds of behaviors that we engaged in over the last 10 years are going to haunt us for a while, even though that you can look at a lot of the empirical measures and it seems like the awakening round is winding down and symbolic capitalists are starting to moderate. And even when you look at people like Kamala Harris. So if you looked at her platform and positions in 2020 versus today, or the Democratic, it's a vast difference, right? But the legacy of these last 10 years is going to be a little bit further reaching than we might like. And so I think the consequences of these last 10 years and the ways that some of the ways that we've conducted ourselves over the last decade, I think that will be clear. The consequences will be a lot clearer. And my hope is that we can learn lessons from all of this, such that the next time that we're facing this period of elite overproduction, we maybe make different and better choices about how we kind of respond to that, about how we carry out some of these struggles and things like this.
I love this, and maybe there will be good. Like, for instance, I do believe that the overall outcome of the Me Too movement is positive. Like, myself and my female friends, we sometimes look back at things that happened before Me Too, and it feels like a different civilization. And we're really happy that we are no longer citizens of the civilization. And there are some things that we don't have to put up with anymore, or even are allowed to say, like, that's wrong. And, I'm quite sure that, somebody coming from an ethnic minority or religious minority, or even a sexual minority, will say at least something positive visibility, better wording, respect might come out of it, right? So there is something where reverting to the mean, right, going to the extreme, but then keeping what was good about it and what we're really trying to get here, which is better lives for as many people as humanly possible, more respect, more opportunities, more freedom, and more, space for self-discovery, right? Which is very limited when you are being discriminated against. My hope is that maybe we will go back to our slumber, but you can't undo things.
Yeah.
It's just many bad things happen in the meantime, right? Like during every revolution, like, you get even more bad stuff than good stuff, and then just hope that the good stuff will stay with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Time only goes one way. History doesn't actually repeat. Sometimes it rhymes, but it doesn't actually repeat.
That's going to be our closing. Maybe you will write an album next. Like, it doesn't have to be be versatile. Come on. Gharbi, what a pleasure, what a privilege that you were with us tonight. Actually, the sun set while we were talking. I think this is the longest podcast I've done. This is usually just 1 hour, but this has been absolutely fascinating. And everybody listening or watching, read the book. We Have Never Been Woke. Even if you have been woke, you want to read this. I mean, we just explained why it's important to engage with ideas that you might not immediately agree with. I think it's a very forgiving and allowing book. A characteristic of all self-searching and self-critical books. And so it's beautiful to me that you start with this stark look at yourself, and through that inward look, we can all see ourselves and feel seen. Thank you so much for being here, and for everybody listening or watching.